It is now my great pleasure to welcome Harriet Washington. Harriet is a prolific science writer, editor, and ethicist who's authored 6 well-received books, including the seminal Medical Apartheid, which won a National Book Critics Circle Award, the Penn Oakland Award, and the American Library Association Black Caucus Nonfiction Award. Her most recent book, Carte Blanche, The Erosion of Medical Consent, was just published last week. Harriet holds or has held research and writing fellowships at numerous prestigious institutions, including Harvard Medical School, New York Academy of Medicine, the University of Nevada's Black Mountain Institute, the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, DePaul University College of Law, the National Center for Bioethics at Tuskegee University, and Stanford University. She delivered the 2020 commencement speech to Columbia University's School of Public Health graduates and won Columbia's 2020 Mailman School of Public Health Leadership Award, as well as its 2020-21 Kenneth and Mamie Clark Distinguished Lecturer Award. Harriet, thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to engage in a conversation for the next little while, and hopefully it won't be an interrogation, but actually something closer to a fireside chat. And then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Excuse me. Harriet, the subject of racism and racial inequity in clinical trials has been in laser focus since the COVID-19 pandemic began. For those who are still new to this issue, could you take a step back and tell us a bit about both historical and present day injustices and missteps?
Well, unfortunately, there have been way too many of those. And unfortunately, we have a long history in this country of 4 centuries of abuse in the medical arena, particularly in research settings when African Americans were disproportionately had their bodies and tissues appropriated without consent, and also were inveigled into some very bloody, invasive, and dangerous research studies, again without their consent, and also with a very inappropriate risk-benefit balance. The non-consensual impression of African Americans into medical research is something that's taken place over 4 centuries and unfortunately has not completely ended today. And we have to keep that in mind when we think about people's reluctance or their purported reluctance to engaging in medical research and clinical trial design. And there is no sphere of American medicine over the past 4 centuries that has not hosted at some point. Reproductive surgeries, involuntary, were done on African American women. Other involuntary surgeries done on African American men. In the prisons, with children, and radiation studies done in the right after World War II, in mid-century. As I said, there's no area of American medicine in which African Americans were not abused, and this long history has to be taken into account whenever we talk about restoring faith in the healthcare system.
I must say, having read your book, Medical Apartheid, that was tough reading, and there were a few examples in there that I guess I'll say we've all heard of, but there were a couple 100 pages of things that most of us hadn't heard of, and it's compelling, and I recommend it. You've spoken in the past about how the news and dialogue on certain issues can be curated. How is the conversation on clinical trials being curated today?
Right.
What are people not understanding or misunderstanding?
Well, I think there are a lot of misunderstandings being perpetuated by this careful curation of not only the history of medicine, but contemporary issues. For example, we find ourselves talking on almost a daily basis about the U.S. Public Health Service study at Tuskegee, in which hundreds of African American men with syphilis were forced into research where they were not treated, but rather had their disease observed until they died. Now, this was certainly a horrible study. It was like 40 years long, the longest instance of medical abuse in the research arena in Western history, but it's only one study. There are other studies that, in my opinion, were even more unethical, definitely more fatal and more dangerous, more painful. And so, unfortunately, though, whenever we talk about African American distrust of the healthcare system, people evoke Tuskegee. And the problem with that is, if you only speak about Tuskegee, if Tuskegee is the only thing that you know about, then the implication is that African Americans are overreacting to a single study. which is not the case. The case is that African Americans are reacting to 4 centuries of consistent abuse. So we're talking about, to ski too much, we should be talking about the history and present of abuses in the research system. And then also, I think we had an unfortunate situation in this country where there was a lot of hand-wringing over the purported failure of African Americans to participate in clinical trials for COVID-19 vaccine, when in reality, when the data were published, we found that African Americans joined trials at 10%. They were 10% of subjects. They're only 12.4% of the population. So I submit that they actually had a fairly respectable showing, commensurate with their rate in the population. So I think we have to be careful to be guided by data and not be guided by the narratives that we have come to habitually adapt when we talk about access problems.
You have well documented centuries of history of abuses. Are there examples of practices that are still prevalent or at least existing today that you can point to?
Well, there are quite a few things, unfortunately, that still exist today. The 19th century Victorian doctors and scientists, the best in the nation, told the world and the country who African Americans were. These were mythologies. They were simply restatements of long-standing myths, but they clothed them with data and made them sound as if they were scientific. Among them were their belief that African Americans didn't feel pain the way whites did, that their belief that African Americans didn't suffer from mental disorders, that we had our own diseases that white people didn't get, and that we were immune to diseases that killed white people, like yellow fever. None of this was true, but it was absorbed by the medical profession. And even today, we might laugh at the thought that doctors once thought that Black people didn't feel pain, but a study in 2016 from University of Virginia shows that 50%, 1 in 2 medical students polled, felt that African Americans didn't feel pain the way whites do. It's still a common belief. A lot of the Victorian beliefs from the 19th century are still common beliefs. And the other thing that the 19th century doctors kindly bequeathed us was a blame the victim attitude toward African American health problems. All too often we had begin interrogating African Americans in terms of, well, what behaviors are they engaging in that perpetuate their illness, or what's wrong with their bodies. And so this biological dimorphism, where we believe that African American bodies are different from white bodies, is also a holdover from that. So, and then the last thing, and probably the most disturbing thing, is my recent book, Carte Blanche, talks about the fact that unfortunately, we still have non-consensual research in this country. It's something that we think that we said goodbye to after Nuremberg, but unfortunately, some changes to the Code of Federal Regulations mean that certain research, we don't elicit consent. And I think that's a step backward. And certainly when people learn of this, I think it serves to erode trust in the research system.
Thank you. In the context of the vaccines, we're hearing a lot about the need for messengers to communicate to the Black community and trusted voices. But I think I've heard you say or write that the real issue is not just, well, that is an issue, but the real issue is the healthcare system itself. And so I guess, and you've pushed back on the notion, as you've just said, that we should be holding the people who are mistrustful responsible for that. Right. And in fact, the burden should be on the healthcare system to, if not regain trust, but to create trust. How can we go about that?
Well, that's exactly a good summary of what I think. I think that, we focus on African American behavior as if the pathological behavior of African Americans is causing the problem. But the problem is also being caused by a healthcare system that's not trustworthy. If it's not trustworthy, people aren't going to trust it. And of course, the solution, it's very facile to say this, but the solution is to make the system trustworthy. If it's trustworthy, people will flock to it. They won't be afraid of it. The hard question is, of course, how do you do this? It's not an easy thing to do. It's a very difficult thing to do. And I think that there are many ways we should attack this. We should continue to encourage African Americans to pursue care that is going to ultimately benefit them. But we should also systemically interrogate the healthcare system, see where it's failing to treat people equitably, see where it's failing to address real issues, see where it is actually creating problems, as it does sometimes, by making it look as if African American bodies are so different that they're prone to disease when really there's something else going on. Systemically, we have to interrogate that and then address it. And ultimately, that is the thing that is going to, I think, engender greater faith in the system. But that takes time. It's not something you can do automatically by social marketing, by showing Black doctors taking the vaccine. That's a good thing to do, but it's just not enough.
Okay, well, we're getting some questions on clinical trials and COVID, but I think we'll come back to them in a minute or two. I want to switch topics just for a minute and talk about patents, because I know that is actually another subject area that you've written about. In our last forum, Preeti Krishtal gave a keynote speech describing how structural racism impacts drug development and access to medicines, from initial funding all the way through affordability. The patent system was one area she brought attention to, which people may never even have considered to examine. You know, given your experience and the work you've done on your book, Deadly Monopolies, can you tell us more about how structural racism shows up in patents and intellectual property?
Yes. In Deadly Monopolies, I decried the fact that since the Bayh-Dole Act and associated laws were passed, the transfer of intellectual property, patents from universities and research centers to corporations, means that corporations now control a great deal of medical research. And it operates against people of color in several ways. One axis is economic, because corporations, profit-making companies, capitalist society, is nothing wrong with making a profit, but if one's sole focus is profit making, and then one's focused on maximizing the money you can make from a patent, if healthcare considerations become secondary, that's very dangerous for people who don't have a great deal of money. When you have medications that are priced above people's ability to pay, or you have populations, as you have in the global south and developing world, populations who are poor, so that the incentive to develop medicines for them can't be an economic one. The corporation is not going to be able to make money and stay solvent if they make drugs for people who can't afford to pay the price they need to pay. So these are that's only one axis. You also have racial disparities that, frankly, I don't pretend to understand. We have diseases like sickle cell anemia, where we've been very slow to find, direct treatments, and yet other molecular diseases like cystic fibrosis actually had good treatments developed more earlier. One could argue it's economics, but I think there's probably more than that at stake. I think that our reliance on the patent system has not worked well for anybody. I don't think it works really well for people of color or other people. And we need to modify the way that we do it. I think that, of course, corporations have the right to make money. They have a right to stay solvent. But we need to have a more nuanced system, as in other countries where they won't give a blanket 20-year patent for everything, but they will have patents that can be renewed. They actually have other systems that reward companies for the number of lives they save, instead of, allowing them to charge any amount of money, whether people can afford it or not. We need to refine our system. I'm not proposing we throw it out at all, but I am proposing that we tailor it more closely to the actual needs of people, including people who have little money, including marginalized people whose medical issues don't always get the attention that they should.
We talked about the example of sickle cell and cystic fibrosis at our last meeting, but I think that was more documenting the existence of the disparity rather than discussing the solution to it. Do you have any thoughts on how you'd go about getting a more equitable research agenda?
In general, I think one of the things we need to do is we have documented some disparities very well. repeatedly, consistently. And I think we have enough documentation on them, and it is time to craft policies. But part of the problem is that we're not systemically looking at everything. Pain, for example, is well documented, but I'm concerned about other things as well. There are many anecdotal accounts from African Americans that when they have symptoms and when they have pain and go to hospitals, their symptoms aren't always accorded the treatment they think it deserves. People, for example, during the coronavirus pandemic, I hear from many people every day who say, I went to the hospital, I had symptoms that sound like coronavirus, they didn't even evaluate me. The internist, Dr. Susan Moore, said the same thing, and she was a doctor. So how do we address that? I think one of the things we have to do is look beyond increased education and training. That's a very good thing to do. But I think that we need to approach some of these disparities like quality of care issues. You know, if an individual physician or an individual research center or a hospital cannot consistently produce a record of treating people of color the same way they treat whites, then there should be some consequences as well as rewards. I believe in rewarding people for the right behavior, but I think sometimes we are very loath because we admire and respect physicians so much. We're very loath to think about, penalties that could be meaningful. I'm put in mind of the hand washing problem that arose in hospitals when, there are foci of infection, and hand washing is really important, and yet a small minority of physicians were not conforming to hand washing strictures, and hospitals were at a loss of how to do that. They were appointing nurses to remind the doctors to wash their hands. That wasn't very popular, and it didn't work very well. But one hospital decided to institute penalties. Surgeons who were not conforming to hand washing regulations found that their pay was being cut. I actually don't think that's a bad idea. It worked very well, by the way. They saw the changes they wanted to see almost right away. And I think that demonstrating that you are practicing medicine that is equitable, racially equitable, should be a condition for finishing medical school, finishing your residency, for advancing in your profession, advancing in your institution. Adding that to the rewards that we should give people for doing that, and to the training and education, I think that would really help get some result. The thing about the pain control studies I've noticed is that people often say, okay, if physicians are not treating African American pain appropriately, if they're sending African Americans away with statements that they're drug seeking instead of treating their pain, then we need better education and training. True. But I also think that we have to remember that there aren't textbooks that tell medical students that African Americans don't feel pain like whites do. I doubt very seriously that anybody's giving a lecture like that. They're learning it on the clinical floors. And so the behavior that they see modeled with African Americans being consistently sent away as drug seeking instead of having their pain treated is something that they, absorb, and then they pass on to the next generation. I think that we need things other than education and training to arrest that vicious cycle and to make it clear that there are penalties for behaving this way instead of rewards.
Have you talked to the specialty societies about this? I mean, I take your point. If we try to address it just through medical school, it's going to take us 2 generations to see the change. Right. But the other place that the physician community looks toward their specialty societies, and are they hearing this message?
I don't know. That's a very good idea. I think you're absolutely right. That's a very good idea. No one's approached me. Maybe I should think about suggesting it.
Because they are sort of the professional standard setting bodies for the physician community. I also just wanted to pick up, and maybe you can speak to this. So at least some of the difference in the care disparities reflects differences in health coverage, Medicaid versus commercial. But we also see differences in commercial populations between white and Black patients.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder, do you attribute that to just sort of a core belief that people are being treated differently? Let me ask the question a little bit differently. It's one thing to say, well, when I'm in an environment of a very low reimbursement,
Mm-hmm.
I might be tempted to turn people away, but for commercial insurance where I have good reimbursement, that turning people away imposes a cost on anybody who's paid on fee for service.
Right. That's true. However, African Americans, for example, are less likely to have high quality insurance. So less likely to benefit from that dynamic. You're absolutely right. But that's one of the barriers that I see between them and good healthcare. The fact that African American is less likely to have their own personal physician to advocate for them in the system, less likely to have quality insurance that will allow them the options they need. So, I think that this is a multifaceted problem. I think we have everything in the mix, everything from, unconscious bias to explicit bias, which we don't like to talk about, which I get. It's very unpleasant. And policies, such as the ones you mentioned, Medicare policies, insurance policies that stand between some people getting the optimal, care that they need. So I think something we have to attack on all fronts, and that's why we need systemic research that is should be open-ended, without preconceptions, identifying a problem and then trying to find out, of course, where it's emanating from, and then maybe attacking all sides.
Thank you. So switching gears a little bit here, I want to talk a little bit about sort of the nexus between personalized medicine and I'll call it racial stereotyping. And the question is, how do we reconcile the notion of greater racial equity in drug development while recognizing at the same time that race itself is not a genetic or biological factor, but a social construct? And you may even want to talk a little bit, if you can, about assumptions people have made about the genetic differences.
There's a lot there to unpack. And, you're right there. But the thing is, when we talk about personalized medicine, the semantics get a bit distorted. If we're really talking about personalized medicine, tailoring medicine to the peculiar characteristics, weaknesses, strengths of a person, then we're talking about more than genetics, aren't we? Genetics is part of that. But there are other things that are part of it too. One aspect of it that I find really important, but I'm not sure everyone agrees with me that it's important, is environmental exposure. We know environmental exposure is a very potent predictor and determinant of people's health. And yet, I don't see it discussed in tandem with personalized medicine. I think it should be. So I think we need to look beyond genetics, and maybe we should even look beyond biological dimorphism, the difference in bodies. There are so many differences that cause, healthcare have healthcare effects that we need to be a little bit more inclusive. When we are looking at genetics, I think sometimes a mistake is made, and I'm not an expert in this area, but I do think the mistake is made of confusing people's heredity with genetics, confusing people's ancestry with genetics. The truth is that in this country, we don't know our ancestry. We have such a strong racial, we've had to deal hundreds of years with these very strong racial taboos that prevent us from knowing our ancestry. So, a good proportion of people who consider themselves African American don't seem to have any physiological evidence of that. And I've read only briefly one paper about white Americans, but many white Americans, when tested, they find that they have, alleles that seem to come from African sources, people who have no idea that they have any Black or African ancestry. So, we have to start with that realization that talking about, genetic reality in this country is fraught with all kinds of taboos and difficulties and ignorance. And so when we're talking about ancestry, we don't often know who we're talking about. And we're talking about genetics maps very poorly onto ancestry. So it's easy to see that, you have all these compounding factors that all contribute to errors in this arena. You're looking for ancestry, but you're using genetics, and genetics would not be a good correlation anyway. But it's hopeless when you don't really know your ancestry. So I think that we need to pull back from trying to force genetics on the Procrustean bed of personalized medicine and look instead at the person. Because frankly, from my perspective, if you're relying upon genetics, then what you're doing is not personalized medicine at all. It's racial medicine. It's stereotype medicine, as you suggested. So, I think we have a lot more refinement to make with these suggestions. And I really want to see environmental effects included in the mix, because I think they're so important, especially for people of color.
So how do we think about that for people doing clinical research? What advice do you give them in terms of how do you know that you have, I'll just call it an equitable trial population? Again, I think there's still this challenge for people trying to say, I don't want to classify people by race because I'm running a clinical research trial that is based on biological response. And yet we don't have other quote unquote markers for how do we know if we're getting a large enough distribution.
Yeah, it's a catch-22, isn't it? Because it's not a biological entity, but we're treating it like one in medicine. We do that a lot. And sometimes it makes little sense to do that. I'm not certain how much sense it makes in a clinical setting. You can easily think of examples of times when it would be important to know someone's race or the race that they're perceived as belonging to. But, that's how I think of it. As long as you remember that what race really tells us is the race that you're seen as belonging to. It doesn't tell you about anything about your inherent makeup. And so when you think about it that way, then it just becomes, really difficult. If what we're really aiming at is making sure that people who are identified as minority populations, identified as African American, Hispanic American, Native American, if we're really trying to make sure that they are included in clinical research, then that inclusion should be the goal. Not necessarily identifying them genetically or physiologically, but just including them. So I think that the proxy is usually just to label them as Black or Hispanic, whatever, and then include them. And that might be the best thing we can do. But I think if you start looking at physiological markers, then you're going to get even farther afield. Because the fact that a person lacks those markers doesn't mean that they're not Native American, doesn't mean that they're not African American. So it's a bit of a maelstrom we've created for ourselves with this concept of race. It's almost like a prison. And I don't know all the answers, but I do know that if you want to include everybody, then that could be done simply by, using race as that proxy. People who identify as African American, they're perceived as African American, you make sure that they're present in the study in a large enough percentage to make the study meaningful for them. So that obviously in a crude way means that if you're doing a study of sickle cell anemia, we wouldn't do that with no African Americans, So it's a hard one for me anyway.
The challenge here, I'm a labor economist by training, and there's a long history of economists studying differences in earnings and wages and wealth in the population, and the statistical equations invariably include a marker for race, Black, white, other, and no one ever does anything with that except to note that it's negative. The earnings are lower, but it's a proxy for so many other things.
Right. I feel a bit impatient. I read medical journal articles, and specifying somebody's race is such an important, a consistent way of describing the patient. But what information does that really convey? Does it really tell you anything? What it tells me is that this is a person who's treated like she's African American. But I'm not really sure how meaningful it is. I'm something I really wish we could be free of, frankly. But I'm not sure that's going to happen.
We have a ways to go. I just want to remind people in the audience to please submit your questions for Harriet, and they're going to get fed through to me, hopefully. And while those are coming in, Harriet, let me ask you, as we're moving forward, to think both about the policy and the public policy and the private policy side. Let's talk about public policy first. What are your hopes for a new administration, a new Congress, and maybe not pinning everything on those two parties, but just going forward, what should we be looking to at federal or state or even local levels?
In terms of maximize health, there's several things I'd love to see happen. One thing that happened is really good. I'm very happy that there have been included experts in the social dimension of medicine. Alondra Nelson being appointed was very, very important to me. So having that dimension early, incorporated in government, part of decision-making policy that's really great. But the things I worry about are things like the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, which is basically gutted over the past 4 years and now needs to be rebuilt. Also, I'm concerned about legal policies governing medical research. I have thought for a very long time, at least 15 years now, that we've made an error when it comes to institutional review boards, the boards that approve medical research. I think it's a mistake to have only one layperson on the board as the law stipulates. That layperson is looking at 15, 16 scientists. They can't have any real say or any voice, any real power. And yet we're putting the burden on that one person to represent a community of laypersons. That's to me, that is it's really it's problematic. How can you expect a body like that to approve studies with full cognizance of how it could be problematic for the subjects who are going to fill it? It's not, they can't do that. It's not really fair. I think it's a bad plan. I would much rather see us have policies like IRBs be composed of half subjects, lay people who would become subjects, and then half scientists, so that from the beginning, there'll be a better chance of incorporating the viewpoint of laypersons, which could, I certainly would hope, would end up with research studies that might be more palatable to people. I also think that healthcare policy should be changed in other basic ways. I want to see people examine the role of lobbyists in healthcare. I think that it's a distorting role. They're lawmakers we've elected to do our will, and lobbyists sometimes I think can really muddy the waters in terms of what the general people, what laypersons want from the government. So I think there are some big policy changes I want to see made, but I also want to see more funding for things like how can I put this? Those corporations who are intent on providing medications to underserved people. I've seen a few cases where they have invested a lot of money and worked really hard, sometimes with NGOs like the Gates Foundation, in trying to create equitable access to medications. And I think the government could play a larger role in supporting that. I think there should be larger rewards for companies that do that. When companies do the right thing, I think we want to, encourage them to do the right thing. And it would have benefits beyond the individual people who are helped. It would have benefits in terms of the healthcare system, making it more equitable, making it more fair, making it something that people are going to think of as a positive way rather than think of negatively. So anyway, I could go on for days, but the bottom line is I think there are some very basic changes that should be made in the law. And we need to have lawmakers who are going to be open to making them. I would love to see more scientists who are has spent a lot of their time in universities and research organizations rather than in the government, so that they can, represent the mentality of, research people and caregivers who want to broaden access. So I hope we'll see all those things.
Yeah, getting lay representation, patient representation is a challenge pretty much across the board, whether it's payment policy or drug approvals or any number of things. I want to go to an audience question here. To what extent can community-based participatory research be used as a method or a tool to help advance health equity?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it can be a really rich tool. involving the communities in the healthcare system, again, serves to lower that barrier that, makes people aversive or prevents people from being able to fully engage and trust it. So if you can involve community groups, not only in the work of the healthcare agencies, but also in determining the direction. A long time ago, I talked to a group of white researchers who'd been very successful in research programs that involved people of color. They were in Black and Hispanic neighborhoods, and they were enrolling people in medical research at a very good rate. I wanted to find out, why are you successful? And they all told me basically the same thing. They said, when we make it clear that we're there for the duration, we're not helicoptering in to get our results and then disappear. If I'm not going to be there 5 years from now, I make it clear that the people I work with, my students, will be there. There'll always be a presence there. So people knew that we were there for the duration, and they had more trust in us. We also asked them what they needed from us. Not that we could necessarily promise it to them, but we wanted them to be able to help have a voice in setting the agenda. And we did everything that we could to incorporate their concerns in what actually happened. And those are the things that seem to, make them very, very effective in providing better care and involving these groups in medical research. Anything that can be done, I think, to improve those relations between the community and the medical institutions that serve it is a good thing. So I'd love to see more of this.
Well, I'm going to ask you kind of another variant of the same question. There are a lot of people on this forum who have both the will and the power to change how clinical research is performed, both people who are running clinical trials, people who are using clinical research. We have a fair representation of industry in the forum. And maybe you could just sort of speak to a couple of those different, I don't like the term stakeholders, participants in the research process.
Well, to those people, I would urge them to engage the communities from whom they draw their subjects in every aspect of research as much as you can, because if they have a role or a voice in deciding which studies are done, how they're done, what approaches are and aren't used, then they're going to be invested in it. And the challenge of recruiting subjects, that's one less hurdle that you'll be dealing with. I think that's really important. That's very good for the community that you're serving, and it's very good for you and your research agenda. I think that's important. Other thing I'm going to say is a bit of an, iconoclastic thing, but I feel it strongly, so I have to speak out on it. And that is, I am deeply concerned about the prevalence of research that does not involve informed consent, or indeed any consent. Since 1996, we've had that change in the law that permitted trauma victims to be involved in medical research without their consent. I think I understand a lot of the impetus for it. Conducting research is very time consuming, it's very difficult, and people welcome something that's going to make you able to complete it more quickly. But here I think it's a really bad bargain. Removing consent from the equation, especially with an utter lack of transparency, is probably going to do more to potentiate distrust than most things that you can do. I think it's a misstep. It's something that we shouldn't be doing, and we should find other routes to being able to conduct research more quickly and effectively.
We have time for just one more question, and maybe it might even from the audience, and it might even be the subject for your next book. So maybe you could just make up the book abstract on the spot.
There you go.
Can you please address bias in analytical tools such as artificial intelligence and algorithms? They've been in the news.
Right. It's a huge problem that I don't claim any particular expertise in, but I know it's been around for a long time. I first became concerned about that back in the 1980s when I saw that there was a debate about the HLA-6 match for kidney transplants, with some doctors saying that it was absolutely essential to give give recipients the best chance for survival, and others saying that it was not necessary, but it did nothing but serve to exclude many African American donors. So eventually the research seemed to support that latter belief. And I began thinking about, all these algorithms and tools, they look, the problem, of course, with them is that they're designed to be objective. Nobody puts one of these in place with the idea that they're going to use them as a tool to separate people from healthcare. Of course not. But that still happens. It can happen without any conscious, desire to do it, simply because of built-in flaws in the system and the way that we think about disease. So we have to be very vigilant. And I think that this kind of vigilance is a kind of thing that, how can I put this? It's not easy to see, but I think we need to interrogate some of our tools, our supposedly unbiased objective tools, more closely than we do. And I also think that there are scholars and scientists who think about this in particular. I'm thinking of Ruha Benjamin, for example, who's done a lot of work in this area. And I think that very often it's going to be, I'm not saying always, of course not, but very often it's going to be scientists and researchers of color who will see these things. They are going to be primed to recognize more quickly than other scientists sometimes. Reason 999 why it's a very good thing to have as many expert scientists and physicians of color as we can, helping to make these policies as well as care for people. It's a big problem, and we have to just guard against falling to a state of complacency where we think that because we are being unbiased and the tools look objective, that they are objective. As we know, sometimes they're not.
Well, as Dr. Copeland noted, you can't manage what you don't measure, and you can't measure what you don't see. So, Harriet Washington, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you in our forum here today. It has been an educational journey reading your work and learning from you, and I thank you for your contributions, and I'm sure everyone has taken a lot away from your remarks today.
Thank you. The pleasure has been all mine, believe me.